Hi, welcome back to PC Builder. I'm Jason. This is our monthly Q&A, and we've got crazy questions about what else. Of course, VRAM on GPUs. Should you abandon your RTX 3080 10GB and chuck it into the trash and look for something 12 or 16GB, or are you going to be just fine? We'll also talk about the launch of the RX 7600. Oh my goodness, could it be that we could get a mainstream GPU at a decent price for most gamers? We'll also take a look at whether or not the 7800X3D is actually worth it for folks playing at 4K or 1440p, or should you just skip that chip in favor of something else? Oops, Dad, I rolled over and there was nothing there. Remember, if you get value out of the video, give it a like to make a huge difference to the channel, and of course subscribe, click that bell icon, that way you get notified when we release cool content. With that, let's jump into it. This video is sponsored by Squarespace, an incredible online platform to create your own website. It's easy to create a community, integrate your latest social media posts, use the powerful blogging tools, and create members-only content that generates revenue. And e-commerce is easy with inventory management, product promotion, and streamlined bookkeeping. Manage your members, send emails, and leverage audience insights in one easy-to-use platform. Use the link below or go to squarespace.com/PCBuilder to sign up for a free trial and get 10% off your first purchase. We got tons of great questions about GPUs, what else, but this time it's not about the GPU market, it's about VRAM, because that's all people have been talking about. We've got great questions from Taurus, from GSX, from Killjoy, FPS Ant, BNB Shred, and others. And the questions are all essentially the same. Are 8GB GPUs DOA if you're buying brand new in 2023? Heck, are older 8GB GPUs that you might be holding onto DOA? Should you rush out and upgrade to something with more VRAM right now? And then what is enough VRAM? Is it 12GB? Is it 16GB? Is it 20 or 24GB? How much are you going to need to be future-proofed in, even at 1080p? So if you haven't been kind of really focused on this question, let me just break it down for you really quick. We've had a couple of releases of AAA titles where they are photorealistic kind of graphics, like The Last of Us Part 1, for instance, where the texture packs in those games are exceeding the VRAM buffer for the card itself. So for instance, an RTX 3070 is an 8GB VRAM card. Now, a lot of people said when that card released, it should have been at least 10GB, probably even 12, and it would deliver playable performance at 4K in a lot of titles. Now, of course, since that 3070 launch, we've had a lot of much faster GPUs, especially the 4090, the 7900 XTX and beyond. As that 3070 has now aged, I think we're getting into 2.5 years since it launched. How is it actually doing? Well, not very well, even at 1080p, once you turn those textures up and once you turn ray tracing on, which is NVIDIA's huge sell on their GPUs. Now, two things can happen when it runs out of VRAM. One is it can kind of just substitute texture packs and then the game doesn't look as good. But some games are essentially breaking when that VRAM buffer gets exceeded and all of a sudden your FPS drops to nothing, your 1% lows kind of drop to nothing, huge amounts of stuttering. And I know a lot of people are saying, oh my gosh, is that going to be every game that's coming down the pipe? I think we need to focus on two things. Number one, we're talking about new AAA title releases, especially in Unreal Engine 5 that's coming down the pike. They're going to use a lot more VRAM because they're photorealistic games. If you're playing World of Warcraft, the VRAM is not that big an issue for you, right? If you're playing League of Legends, not that big an issue. If you're playing Fortnite, if you're playing CSGO, if you're playing those kinds of titles, this is not really an issue whatsoever. Now you want to, obviously, I'd recommend 8 even for budget GPUs on those games. We're talking about titles where you're going to buy in the latest AAA title. It's on release. It's at its most unoptimized point when it first releases, right? Want to play that game at high frame rates. Well, I think the days of being able to do that with 8GB of VRAM are over. I think if you want to be safe, I would take a look at 12GB, but honestly, right now, I'd look at 16. And again, 16GB for whom? If you're spending less than $300, it's probably unrealistic for you to buy more than 8GB. You're not buying into the high end of the market. You're buying into what has become the budget tier of the market. But if you're spending more than $300, now I think you're expecting a different level of performance by spending that amount of money. You're expecting a different level of longevity to the GPU, a higher quality of product, right? That's what you're spending extra money for. Buying a higher end, I would really look to get 16GB of VRAM. And I know that's going to kind of put a number of NVIDIA products off limits, like the 4070 Ti and the just released 4070, which have 12GB of VRAM. Now, I haven't seen any instances where 12 gigs is not enough space. I haven't seen that yet. But I just have a word of caution because I think a lot of this is coming from consoles. And what do I mean? Well, consoles have a unified memory bus, basically, a unified memory system for 16 gigs of memory. Basically, they use it both in the processing as well as the graphical processing. It works differently than PC, so I don't want to make too close an analogy, but they've got this much larger pool of RAM to pull from, where gaming PCs kind of, they segregate off. This is our VRAM over here, and this is our system RAM over here. Consoles don't have that problem. And the other issue with PCs is, with consoles, there's one optimization for the PS5. There are two optimizations, one for the Xbox Series S, one for the Xbox Series X. That's it. For PCs, think about all the different hardware configurations out there. Tens of thousands of hardware configurations out there. And so, as they're looking about, hey, where are most of our sales going to come from? Well, a much larger chunk of sales are coming from console now, much more of the value proposition. So companies are like, well, why are we continuing to spend all these resources optimizing for PC over here when a lot of our sales are over here in console land? Yeah, we still want those PC sales. We're not going to get rid of them, but PC is no longer the number one thing to optimize for. So on the one hand, the games themselves are getting more demanding. On the other hand, developers have less and less incentive when they're launching to multiple platforms to really optimize for all these different PC hardware requirements. And I think they're being a little kind of cranky about this, just in my personal estimation. Not all of them, but a couple of them. Well, it's just too hard. It's not too hard. They could invest the time. It would reduce their profit margins on stuff. It would be a cost to them. But you can see games like Jedi Survivor, for instance. That game released very, very broken on PC and on console, I should say. So I think that going forward, if you're thinking about the amount of VRAM on your GPU, that's largely being driven by kind of the profit incentive of these big game developers. If you want to play smaller indie titles that are PC only, I wouldn't worry about it. But if you want to play these AAA titles that are going to come out cross-platform, you want to play them day one, you don't want any problems, then yeah, you probably 12, 16 gigabytes of VRAM is where you're looking. We got a great follow-up question from Chelsea. If you got a 30 series GPU with 10 gigs of VRAM, should that be fine for the next couple of years? Or should you look at upgrading the 40 series sooner? Well, honestly, we're talking about the RTX 3080 10 gigabyte, right? That was the one that launched that everyone was super gaga for. In fact, people paid thousands of dollars, up to $2,000+ during the shortage from retailers, not even from scalpers. They paid more than that from scalpers. And now you're a couple years later, you're looking at that GPU, it's got 10 gigs of VRAM. You're like, oh my gosh, what in the heck happened? And I know a lot of people are having buyer's remorse for those cards. And then the other question is, if you want to go NVIDIA, what do you upgrade to? A 4070 12 gigabyte, a 4070 Ti 12 gigabyte, you're only adding 2 gigs of VRAM, for crying out loud. Now, if you got an RTX 3080 12 gigabyte, you're probably in a much better shape right now, right? You're feeling a lot better about that card. The 3080 is kind of in the gray zone right now. So you might have to turn down some settings, which is not something that I think 3080 owners would even want to think about when they were buying that card, because they thought they were buying essentially the flagship GPU and that it was going to be kind of top dog for a number of years. All of a sudden they turn around, it's not the case. I don't know what to tell you for 3080 owners, but I do think that the days of that card are way more limited than the 3080 12 gigabyte card. And if you are thinking about upgrading, I really feel like the 4070 12 gig is a side grade. If anything, slightly better performance. Yeah, we'll wait to see what AMD releases. 6950 XT, the card maybe you should have bought a couple of years ago instead of the 3080 10 gigabyte. Looks really, really good right now for $600 with its 16 gigs of VRAM. We may even hit a point where those older RX 6000 series cards with more VRAM actually end up ray tracing better because they won't exceed the VRAM buffer on these brand new super AAA titles. I don't really know what to tell you for 30 series owners. I think it is a big question mark. We got a great question about the GPU market, GPU prices. Sarabdeo, I apologize if I mispronounce your name there. The GPU industry seems to be forcing a new trend of higher prices on consumers and tech reviewers by not reducing GPU prices. What are my thoughts on that? Well, here's my thoughts on it. My thoughts are, you're absolutely right. NVIDIA is the main culprit, but AMD is very much culpable in this as well. Let's go through how this happened. I don't think they're going to end up being successful in it, but I think we are going to go through a period of pain, both the companies as well as gamers, because they want to have their heads stuck in the sand and they want to basically see who blinks first in terms of this price war that they've got with gamers right now. Well, how'd this happen? Well, we had the cryptocurrency boom. It was all based on Ethereum mining. Profits for that went through the roof. The GPU mineable, so GPU miners started buying all the GPUs out there. Scalpers saw, hey, these GPU miners will pay whatever for them. So the scalpers developers started buying them first from the retailers and then marking them up, we got in a really vicious cycle where all of a sudden you're paying $3,500, $4,000 for an RTX 3090, $2,500, $2,600 for an RTX 3080. Insane amounts of money for GPUs that should have cost a lot less. I saw the end of this coming, and I did a lot of videos in 2021 and 2022 saying, hey, what's going to happen is Ethereum is going to move to proof of stake. It's going to kill off GPU mining. GPU miners are going to basically no longer be buying cards, so the demand is going to completely slump in the new market. And in the secondary market, those GPU miners will likely start selling off all their cards in order to recoup their investment in those cards, because a lot of them are going to be underwater if they don't do that. That's exactly what we've seen. But AMD and NVIDIA, and for whatever reason, the millions and millions they must pay to their business analysts who look at the GPU market, kind of figure out what the pricing and everything's going to be in the future. All those folks were predicting, oh, it's just going to be completely crazy times. And they completely abandoned gamers during this. They were happy to abandon gamers. So here we are. NVIDIA is absolutely refusing to reduce prices on things like the RTX 4080, the 4070 Ti, which the 4080 12GB we all know. What's happened? Gamers are largely rejecting them, but it's going to take a while of poor quarterly earnings growth, of poor revenue growth, continuing to report that out to shareholders. You're going to have to see their stock price get battered a little bit before they pull their heads out of the sand, because they believe that gamers are spending money that could be expanded on. They believe that if you are somebody who usually spends $1,500 on a gaming system or maybe $500 on a graphics card, that you can be forced to squeeze out 50% more than that, 100% more than that. And I think what we're finding out right now is the gamers are saying either they're not willing to do it or they're not able to be squeezed for as much. That high-end buyers are still buying 4090s because that's the best GPU. But for everybody else who actually cares about value in the market, they're trying to enforce these higher prices, but it's not working. That being said, I don't think we're going to be able to talk them out of it. I think it's going to have to be their share price going down that talks them out of it eventually. We got more GPU related questions this time about the RX 7600 or 7600 XT, whatever it's going to be called, from Zokia MX and TAC 1440. And this is a GPU, just by the way, that I actually have no inside information on. Everything that I know is based on rumors and links that you have seen as well. Folks like Moore's Law is Dead, video cards with the Z at the end, and other kinds of outlets out there. Effectively, what they're saying right now, to kind of sum it up, is that basically they're claiming that the GPU is going to release in May, towards the end of May 2023, the RX 7600, the performance leaks that I've seen, again, this is all leaks and rumors, that the performance of that GPU is going to be somewhere on the order of an RX 6700 non-XT, maybe slightly faster than that. That card, by the way, has 10 gigs of VRAM. It's currently selling for about $300. In terms of the VRAM, it's going to have 8 gigs of VRAM. Nobody has any kind of pricing guesses out there. Everyone's just speculating. So let me do the same. Is this going to be the 6650 XT killer, or is it going to be a flop like the RTX 4070 was a flop? It all depends on the price, to be honest. I don't think there's anything wrong with an 8GB VRAM card, because this is supposed to be a budget tier GPU. And as long as that card is priced appropriately, I think it's going to be a 1440p level performance card. If we just leave VRAM aside, if we just look at the rasterization without the textures and everything. So what does that card need to cost? I'd say if it's $250, it's a big winner. If it's $300, it's a big loser. And really, I think it is down to that knife's edge. And I suspect we'll see some kind of $279 pricing or $269 pricing. But the thing that AMD really needs to get away from is overpricing its GPUs, selling a handful of them, and then having it not sell, and then embarrassingly having to climb down from the price. That's what happened with the RX 7900 XT, right? Not the XTX, but the XT. If it comes in at $300, why wouldn't I just tell you to go buy a 6700 non-XT with 10 gigs of VRAM that performs almost the same, or the 6700 XT for slightly more money, outperforms it and comes with 12 gigs of VRAM? It just wouldn't make any sense. Great question from Agent Smith 1902. What kind of CPU GPU combo are important if you're talking about using more than one monitor for gaming? Different monitors with different refresh rates might affect performance, etc., etc. What would I recommend? Well, it honestly, obviously depends on the resolution you're playing at. But let's say 1440p, for instance, very popular resolution right now. What if you want to have two monitor setup? Or what if you want to have an ultra wide setup? What do you need to run that monitor? Well, the more pixels that the GPU has to render, doesn't matter one screen, two screen, the more pixels it has to render, that's going to require more processing power. But it's not necessarily a one-to-one because of the way GPUs work. It's not that if I have two monitors now, I need double the power to get the same frame rate, because some of the overhead and the drivers and everything are kind of already accounted for and they're not needed. It's not quite a one-to-one. I will say to you this, there's not a lot of really good testing out there on what you need to drive two monitor setups. We've got tons and tons of really good testing in terms of what if you want a single monitor at a single resolution. So maybe it's something that we can just take a look at in the future for double or triple monitor setup. Let me know down in the comments if this is something that would be interesting to you. I would take a look at benchmarks for what those cards do on the games that you play in widescreen format. And then I would probably jump up to the next GPU tier. So for instance, if a 6700 XT gets, 100 FPS in a certain title at regular resolution, which is widescreen 16:9, and I had an ultra wide monitor, I'd say, hey, if I want to get that same resolution, I'd probably go up to the, 6800, maybe 6800 XT if I had two monitors. That's how I would think about it and approach it. All right, Amethyst Budgets asks, when building a gaming PC versus a PC for gaming and video editing, so a hybrid PC basically, what do you need to think about in order to tackle both? How would I recommend someone upgrade a gaming PC for video editing? Or is that even necessary? Well, the good news is for most folks, if you have a modern 6-core or faster CPU, even like the i3 12100F or 13100F, will do video editing just fine if you're doing it at an amateur level and you're not doing a lot of effects and it's relatively simple and you're using like 1080p video and you got a decent enough video card like a GPU like an RX 6600, 6650 XT, RTX 3060. All that's going to be absolutely fine for you with 16 gigs of RAM too, with 16 gigs of RAM. For instance, this is our 5600X gaming system we built in September 2021. You can check the video out, and it's got an RTX 3060 Ti in it. I edit video on this on an infrequent basis, and this is absolutely fine for my needs, even for a YouTube channel. But most of the editing for this channel, most of the editing period that we do is actually on our Ryzen 5950X system that we built in January of 2022. And that has an RTX 3080 Ti. Unfortunately, the 3080 Ti actually died on us. So it's right now an RTX 3060, and my wife is not happy about it. We are going to replace and upgrade that whole PC very soon. But it's a much more powerful PC. It's got 64 gigs of RAM on it. So that's the system that we use to do 40-hour week professional level video editing. So I would say right now, if you want a hybrid system, the number one thing, and you already have a gaming PC, the number one thing I would look at doing is your graphics card, capable enough to do all the encoding? And if it's not, then I would upgrade that. The other thing is, do you have a relatively modern 6-core or greater CPU? And then the other thing I would take a look at is how much RAM do you have? There is a big jump going from 16 gigs to 32 gigs, depending on the complexity and the size of the projects you're loading. And the other thing is storage. You need tons and tons of storage for all the video that you're doing. So you need to figure out a storage solution. For us, we have an X570 motherboard with 4 M.2 slots, and they're all 2 terabyte M.2s on it. So 8 terabytes total on that PC just with that. And it still feels like it's full all the time, even with 8 terabytes of storage. So these are the things you got to think about as you ramp up, but it all depends on how much of this work you're actually doing. Mitchell Vernon asks, in a lot of videos, I talk about the CPU isn't going to bottleneck the GPU. At resolutions at 1440p and above, is there a big enough performance gain from the 7700X to the 7800X 3D to justify the cost? Let's jump into that one. It depends on the GPU that you're buying. If you have all the money in the world, then of course buying the 7800X 3D with an RTX 4090 is a no-brainer, right? But if you have this thing called a budget and you're limited by that budget, then you basically focus on how do I get the most FPS for this set amount of money? Maybe I can spend $100 more, but kind of this is roughly what I have to spend. So any additional money I spend on my CPU got to come out of somewhere. It's going to come out of the storage. It's going to come out of the quality of the power supply. It's going to come out of the quality of the motherboard. It's going to come out of the tier of GPU that I'm able to buy as well. It's all a balancing act. Yeah, I know we like to look at things like the 7800X 3D in the benchmarks in isolation where everything else is held constant, but that's not how we actually build gaming PCs, right? We build them with these things called budgets. So that's the interrelation between all of these, is how much they actually cost in relation to the overall budget. So I would say, number one, GPU is king. And I know people say, well, what about future-proofing? You can drop drop in a new GPU, yeah, 3 or 4 years from now, but by then you may even want to upgrade the entire system. Honestly, you may even want to drop in a new CPU anyway, because we're talking Ryzen 7000. If you go with a 7600 right now, it's $200 cheaper than the 7800 X3D. If I want to play at 1440p, and that gets me from a 7900 XT up to the 7900 XTX GPU, that's going to make a bigger difference. And you're not going to want to upgrade as soon if you've got that faster GPU anyway. And in the future, you'll be able to drop in a 8800 X3D or 9800 X3D or whatever the heck they call at least the next generation of CPUs, because you'll have that future upgradability there. So I wouldn't overspend, especially in this generation, especially if you're playing 1440p or 4K. I would not overspend on the CPU to the detriment of your GPU. That's the caveat here. Again, if you're buying a 4090, I wouldn't cheap out and get a 7600 at that point. I would go ahead and get the 7800 X3D, because at that point, you're talking about a buyer who's not really price pressured by their budget, but most people are price pressured by their budget. So that's how I would think about that. Then Lord Andre JTM, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Do I think with people like CPUs like 5600, 5700, 5800X, so on AM4 should upgrade to AM5, or should they drop in the 5800 X3D instead? It just depends on what GPU you're going with, how much you're gonna spend. If you've got like a Ryzen 5600 system with a 6650 XT in it, no, don't upgrade your CPU, upgrade the GPU. That's the next upgrade for that system. Now there comes a point at which the CPU is not gonna be able to keep up as adequately given how fast that GPU becomes. Then it does make sense to go from a 5600, and I would skip everything else. I'd go either the 5800 X3D, or I would look at jumping up to possibly the Ryzen 7600, 7700. But again, the 5800 X3D, I've got the motherboard. I don't have to rebuild the system. I can drop that straight in. It's very enticing just to spend $300 one time. If I've already got like a 7900 XT or something, say, oh, you know, I'd also like some more FPS. Can't get a new GPU for $300. It's faster than my 7900 XT, but I can go out and I can get a 5800 X3D and I can get an upgrade that way. Yeah, that would make a lot of sense. But for folks who are, you know, building new, I think Ryzen 7000 is increasingly making tons and tons of sense, as long as you got that faster GPU going. We've got Den Ultra says, do I believe that NVIDIA will ever be dethroned by another graphics card company? Well, there's only two other ones, right? There's Intel and there's AMD. Can NVIDIA be dethroned? I think they're as vulnerable to being dethroned as ever right now. If you look at the VRAM issues that they've got themselves into, if you look at their terrible business planning for this series of GPUs, believing that the market was going to continue to race off the charts, primarily selling to miners, yeah, they've really positioned themselves terribly, and they want to stick their heads in the sand in terms of their pricing. They don't want to budge those prices down. Example I'll use is Intel. Intel seemed unbeatable before Ryzen launched. I mean, AMD was nowhere to be found. Their CPUs were terrible. Intel was just spoon feeding us little performance increases, and they seemed completely unbeatable, and we all hated it. But at the same time, we're like, well, I don't know what's going to change. It doesn't seem like anything could ever change. And then here we are, fast forward, you know, Ryzen got introduced, AMD got hungry, and they introduced Ryzen. It started to build momentum, and they went boom, boom, boom. And next thing you knew, it was no longer Intel at the top of the gaming charts. It was now AMD, or they got close enough to the point where people didn't care anymore about, you know, very, very small differences. I think AMD or Intel even could do the same in the GPU market, but they've got to be hungry, because NVIDIA has really set themselves up to be taken down, but there has to be somebody who actually wants to take them down. I don't know if AMD's up to the task anymore. I'm not seeing the killer instinct that we used to see. Hopefully with the 7600 launch, that'll change. I'm eager to see more competition, and I've got my fingers crossed. All right, Bullen Cullen asks, so I saw you got to Masters in Overwatch 2 recently. What heroes do I play? Yeah, I got to Masters in support. I'm the kind of player I really like to flex in terms of what my team needs. I really do like playing Moira. She's probably about 50% of my playtime on support, because she can very quickly flex to a backline flanker, or she can just turn out tons and tons of heals, stall objectives, and do things like that. So I really like Moira. And then kind of on the other 50% is a mixture, depends on what the team needs. Zen is probably my #1 go-to when I feel like we just can't get anything to die. We're not getting any kills. Go to Zen very, very quickly. Or if our tank, I feel like, is getting super bullied, immediately switch to Zen and start bullying their tank with Discord. Or if I've got a DPS who I feel like is super popping off and could really help carry, then I'll switch to Mercy. Definitely pocket the tank and that DPS at the same time. On King of the Hill maps, I do play a lot of Lucio as well, especially if you can get environmental kills and boot people off. Remember, if you got value out of the video, give it a like. This makes a huge difference to the channel, especially this guy right here. and of course subscribe and click that bell icon. That way you get notified when we release cool content. Speaking of cool content, have you checked out our Boost My Build series, where we take your PC build list, we tear them up, we put them back together and massively increase your performance? Check it out right here. They're a lot of fun, and we'll catch you on the next one.